Cheers, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am Dave Brown, and this is the New Populist. We have some interesting things happening right now in the country of Georgia. Now, Georgia is a former Soviet republic. It is the home of Stalin, the Soviet dictator. And right now, they are having some clashes with the government, actually inside the government. Fights breaking out in Parliament, apparently, and protesters attacking the Parliament, breaking windows, knocking over gates. Something that, ironically, would be described as an insurrection if it were Trump supporters on January 6th, breaking windows, right? Illegally entering places. Well, these protesters are acting on behalf of the West, which is why we do describe them as being violent, but we're not calling them insurrectionists or people trying to overthrow the government. These are just angry protesters. So what is going on that has these protesters so angry? And why is the West paying attention to what's going on there? Well, Georgia is passing a law that says if you have received 20% of your funding from overseas, and you're an organization, you're lobbying, you're in politics, media, you have to register as a foreign agent or be fined. Now, personally, I go, doesn't seem like that big a deal. You don't want foreign influence, and certainly within the United States. I mean, just think about the last 7 years with the Russian influence, allegedly, how angry we were. And when this war in Ukraine started, we kicked out Russian media, RT. So we've acted very pointedly against countries we don't like as far as them having influence here. And in fact, the United States has its own laws about foreign agents, which is the FARA Act, which is the, let me pull it up here real quick. It is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which goes back to 1938, which says if you're going to operate on behalf of a foreign government and be engaged in political activities, you must register so that we know who you are and what you're doing, because clearly your activities being political might be contrary to our democratic values. And so the U.S. government wants to know who you are. And likewise, the Georgian Parliament, who are voting for this law, want this as well. But we on the West are describing it as an attack on democracy. And this might jeopardize Georgia's entrance into the EU. Now, why are we looking at it this way? Let's remember, Georgia is a former Soviet republic, just like Ukraine, just like Belarus. And what has NGOs, non-governmental organizations, the CIA, the State Department been doing over the last 20 years? Color revolutions. And how do you do a color revolution? Well, you do it, it's nonviolent. You fund groups within a country to oppose the government. You start protest, you stir things up, and eventually, like in Ukraine in 2014, you have a revolution that chases the government out, and then the United States installs a pro-West person. So you can understand why Georgia might be concerned about color revolutions and why they might want this law. The prime minister is more pro-Russian, and the president is more pro-West. And so they're having this rift here. And the prime minister is saying, I want to be part of the EU. I just don't want the foreign influence. But let's go through the Washington Post article and listen how they describe this, because it's always interesting when we look at other countries. And if what was happening there was happening here, we would completely invert the situation. We would never allow other countries to meddle in our stuff. And when they have, we freak out, and rightfully so, although sometimes it is exaggerated, like the case of Russia. But we're constantly sticking our beak in other countries, trying to dictate to them how they should behave. And we're involved in their internal affairs. And we are, in this sense, in this case, complete hypocrites. But the article from the Washington Post, violent clashes in Georgia over foreign influence bill opposed by the West. The bill cleared an initial vote in Georgia, whose government has increasingly clashed with Western officials over its rights record and increasingly authoritarian approach. The draft law would require non-governmental organizations and media outlets that receive more than 20% of their annual revenue from abroad to register as agents of foreign influence, which would subject them to additional scrutiny with significant penalties possible for violations. Now, again, is this unreasonable? And one thing to keep in mind is that Georgia is a small country, less than 4 million people. So unlike the United States, a cash infusion from a foreign source, like the United States, can go a long way. $10 million in Georgia goes a lot further than $10 million in the United States. So perhaps these countries have to be a little more stringent than, say, the United States with their laws to prevent these foreign influence. The article continues, both law enforcement and demonstrators were injured in Tuesday evening's incident, the Interior Ministry said. Authorities used water cannons and tear gas to disperse protesters, some who threw stones and petrol bombs. Christ almighty, Reuters reported. People outside Parliament chanted, "Russians, Russians," according to video shared on social media, in an apparent reference to a 2012 law passed by the Kremlin that was subsequently expanded and used to harass critics. Now, right there, that's they're editorializing right there. I have no clue if that actually happened. Perhaps it did. But yeah, they're throwing rocks and petrol bombs over a law that says if you have foreign influence, foreign money, you need to register. Kind of an overreaction, unless you consider the fact that this avenue is so important for the West to get into these small countries to cause these random or spontaneous revolutions. So, very important law. The article continues. The protest was originally peaceful, but then became an organized attack on Parliament, the statement said. Members of the manifestation set fire to the building of the legislative body, threw stones, smashed windows, and damaged the iron protective barriers. The bill threatens to jeopardize the former Soviet republic's application to join the European Union, which raised concerns over the draft law and called it inconsistent with European values. The EU flag was prominently displayed at Tuesday's rally. I wonder why, because these people are pro-EU, and probably some of them are being paid or part of organizations from the West that are trying to stir things up. Now, the article says Prime Minister Irakli Karabashavli, wow, that's difficult, struck a defiant note Tuesday and accused Georgian civil groups of fighting against state interests with the help of foreign funding, according to the Agenda, an English language news platform affiliated with the government. He said his administration was still pro-European, but that Georgia had the sovereign right to decide its own laws, decide on its laws, which doesn't seem unreasonable to me. If the majority of the parliament voted for it, just like in our country, there's laws passed all the time that I don't like, but if it gets past the Senate and the House and is signed by the president, that's democracy, right? Well, it's democracy when it works in the interest of globalists. When it goes contrary to their interest, now it's not democracy anymore. And it's funny to mention here that one of the critics of this law is the European Council on Foreign Relations, otherwise known as the CFR, which of course we know is a gigantic globalist group. And also in the article, it talks about the U.S. State Department weighing in, saying that this is terrible, it's attack on rights. Again, why the U.S. is so involved in the internal process of a small country in Eastern Europe. Why are we so involved in that? Do we care what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa? Not really. Why do we care so much about Georgia? Because it's part of those countries that we want to get involved in and turn against Russia for our long-term geopolitical goals. Now, one thing I find funny is that in the United States, conservatives will openly call out George Soros for his subversive activities within the United States. And of course, he supports these district attorneys that are do things like, let all the criminals out. They don't charge any of these Black Lives Matter people or Antifa, and they undermine the rule of law. So we recognize in this country, in the United States, that George Soros is a bad operator. The funny thing is, George Soros also operates in these Eastern European countries through his Open Society Foundation. And according to his website, the Open Society Foundation has raised or contributed $80 million in Georgia to support these pro-democracy groups. $80 million. And again, in a tiny country like Georgia, $80 million goes a long way. And George Soros was also donating money in Ukraine. He raised $300 million in Ukraine, which is why George Soros, his organization, is banned in Russia and it's banned in China. I wonder why. If they're paying attention going, this is how the West, through NGOs, and with involvement with the CIA, State Department, they infiltrate a country and they stir crap up. Now, this is not me supporting authoritarianism in Russia or China. This is me saying it's none of our business. Stop meddling in other countries. Let those countries have their own laws, their own rules. It's their own culture, their own history. Let them make their own decisions. It's not for the United States to get involved and stir crap up. So these conservatives in the United States recognize how poisonous George Soros is in the United States, but they don't talk about George Soros operating in these Eastern European countries. So it kind of shows you the hypocrisy there. He's bad here, but when it comes to Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, we're not going to say a word. So these big name conservatives on TV who always talk about George Soros being evil, they don't mention him in Georgia, don't mention him in Ukraine. And again, this is because their hatred of Russia is so strong that they're willing to give a pass to a creep like George Soros if George Soros is doing something that is going to hurt Russia, in their opinion, in the long run. So pay attention to Georgia. The prime minister said that he has enough votes to override the veto from the president. So this law should be passed and go into effect. But pay attention to how the U.S. media treats it. And again, my position is not that I support it or don't support it. My position is very simple. It's none of my business. It's none of our business. Let Georgia decide for themselves how they want to run their country. Is that such a bad thing? Apparently it is if you are a neoconservative globalist who thinks that you can go around the world telling other countries how they should behave, how they should act, and what they should do. But that's what we do in the United States. Our neoconservative politicians, our globalists, they're hypocrites. They have double standards, and they are creating a world that is much more dangerous than it should be. Well, that's it for now. If you are new to this channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.